Hello, and welcome to another session in our series of Biblical Worldview teaching classes. This session will focus on the Christian worldview of law, which I'm sure you'll find to be a lot more applicable to your life than you might imagine. We've divided this teaching of law into 4 parts. Part 1 will focus upon the proposition that American Christianity is suffering today because we've lost our balance. Throughout the Bible, God's mercy is always balanced by His justice. His great love is always balanced by His tremendous wrath towards sin. His amazing grace is always balanced by His eternal law. Throughout Scripture, we find that these opposing principles are finely tuned. In other words, if we were to amplify or elevate either one of those opposing principles above the other, then the people inevitably will lose their balance, stumble, and fall. Now in Part 2, we'll define the propositions that make up the Christian worldview of law, followed by the contrasting principles of secular humanism, which of course is the worldview of today's Western political and educational institutions. Again, we can't study our views just in a vacuum. We always must compare and contrast our ideas with opposing ideas so that we learn to critically think through them, to weigh each side of an issue and then decide which ideas make more sense, which ones are more reasonable and logical and are more wise to live by or not wise to live by. And then in Part 3, we'll review the history of American law from the earliest beginnings in the colonies to the end of the 20th century. In Part 4, we'll pick up from there and we'll present the state of law as it exists today, which I'm sure will shed light on why we're experiencing such tremendous moral and social decay at this time in our history. And then we'll conclude with the challenge for Christians, you and I, to pick up the torch of the early Puritans' worldview of God's law, which they first lit here in America. The Christian view of law that has brought such spiritual and intellectual illumination to the entire world ever since. In the end, we trust that you'll be both enlightened and encouraged greatly. So let's begin by watching a short video, which simply is meant to get our attention and to cause us to focus on why our worldview of law is so critically important today.
75-year-old grandmothers facing 47 years in prison for offering an alternative to the homosexual lifestyle. 7th graders in public school being forced to assume Islamic names and stage their own jihad. A church being forced to participate in lesbian civil unions. A man brought up on hate crimes charges because he wrote a letter to the editor of his local newspaper. A mother told she can't read a passage from the Bible to her son's kindergarten class, but given a recommendation that she read them a book about witches instead. These examples are not fiction, and they aren't happening in some restrictive, far-off country. These are real cases and just the tip of the iceberg of what is happening right here in our midst. Across this nation, parents are learning they can't teach their children according to their religious beliefs because it might be considered hate speech. You might think, oh, that can't be true. I would have heard about this. Well, the fact is, the voices of the opposition are so loud that they've been drowning out the soft cries of Christians across the country who've been victimized.
All under arrest for what? What law have we violated?
We hadn't done anything wrong. I was handcuffed and accompanied the other people into the paddy wagon.
Kept taking our pictures and fingerprints. I realized that we weren't getting out right away. 3 felonies? I just couldn't imagine, just for trying to share the gospel.
The idea that only special classes of people get special protection violates everything that this country is about.
These examples, I think, are illustrations for us and warnings to us of what happens when we're called to be salt and light, when we're supposed to be going out there and being active in the world, and yet for some reason most Christians don't care. There are 2 great deceptions that Satan has been working on in the last 130 years or so.